Welcome to the channel, Forgotten Women of History. Imagine a world in which a woman did not dare to speak a single word without a man's permission. A world in which a Tsar's daughter was doomed to slowly fade behind blank walls. With no right to marry, no right to choose her own fate, no right even to show her face to a stranger. Her future was sealed from birth prayers, embroidery, and a quiet death in a convent cell. But one of them refused to accept that fate. A Tsarevna who had been groomed for oblivion managed to break out of her gilded cage, to step over centuries of prohibition, and to ascend the Russian throne. She ruled an enormous empire for 7 years. And against all odds, she ruled wisely, boldly, and truly successfully, even if her story ended in tragedy. Today, I'll tell you about the first woman who seriously took power over Russia into her own hands, a woman whose name the victors did their best to erase from memory. But before we begin, one small request. If you're watching without subscribing, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It really matters for a growing channel, and it helps true stories about strong women reach others too. And now, let's begin. In 1676, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich died.
The title, Tsar, means emperor or king.
And deep within the Kremlin palace, the fortified citadel at the heart of Moscow that served at once as the monarch's residence and the seat of the state's government, the lives of several women froze in place. They could not step outside without special permission. They could not choose a husband. They could not even show their faces to an unrelated man. These were the Tsarevna's daughter.
Tsarevna means a Tsar's daughter.
Born to spend their lives in luxurious captivity and to die as nuns in a convent cell. Among them was 19-year-old Sophia Alekseyevna. She sat by a clouded mica window of the terem.
The terem was the secluded women's quarters of the palace, something between a harem and a convent, where the women of the royal family were hidden from outside eyes.
And watched the courtyard below where her father's funeral procession was unfolding. For now, she was only one of the Tsar's daughters, doomed to fade away far from power. No one could yet know where her mind, her stubbornness, and her hunger for action would lead her. But something about this young woman already set her apart from her sisters, and soon all of Moscow would see it. The terem was a world unto itself, with its own laws. Tall windows framed by carved surrounds looked out onto interior courtyards, but the thick sheets of micas glass remained a rarity even in the palace, so distorted the light that it was nearly impossible to see anything outside. The rooms lay in half darkness even at midday. Candles and icon lamps threw flickering shadows across the painted walls. The air was heavy with incense, wax, and costly fabrics. Here the Tsarevnas passed their days in prayer, needlework, and the reading of religious books. Leaving the terem was a rare event, a religious procession or a pilgrimage to a monastery. Even then the Tsarevnas rode in closed carriages, surrounded by guards and nannies, like precious cargo not to be shown to the world. The Tsarevnas were not given in marriage. It was believed that no groom in Russia was worthy of royal blood, while to give a daughter to a foreign prince meant condemning her to live in heresy among Catholics or Protestants. And so the Tsarevnas became eternal maidens, living out their days in the terem before taking the veil and dying in convents. Their fate was a slow fading behind high walls, far from the real life of the state. But in Sophia Alekseyevna lived something that set her apart from her sisters: defiance, a hunger for knowledge, and a sharp mind that would not be content with embroidery and prayer. Chapter 1. The Teacher from Polotsk. While Sophia was still a child, a man entered her life who would shape her entire destiny: Simeon of Polotsk, a monk from the Belarusian town of Polotsk, educated at the Kiev Mohyla Academy, the oldest institution of higher learning in the Orthodox world, where they taught not only theology but Latin, rhetoric, and philosophy. Simeon had become the court poet and tutor to the royal children during the lifetime of Alexei Mikhailovich from the late 1660s. He was a rare figure in Moscow. He knew Latin and Polish, wrote poems and plays for the court theater, and, almost unheard of in that age, did not believe that education was forbidden to women. On the contrary, in the young Sophia he saw an exceptionally gifted pupil. The lessons took place in a separate room of the terem, which the monk was permitted to enter as a clergyman and tutor to the royal children. The girl sat at a heavy oak table laid with leather-bound books, a rarity and a treasure in those days. She learned to read not only Church Slavonic, but also Latin, the language of European scholarship and diplomacy. Simeon told her of the courts of Europe, of how states were governed beyond Russia's western borders, of women who had ruled kingdoms: Queen Elizabeth I of England, the French regent Catherine de' Medici. For a girl locked in the terem, these tales were windows onto another world, one in which a woman could be not a recluse, but a moving force of history. Sadly, Simeon of Polotsk did not live to see his pupil rise to the heights of power. He died in 1680, when Sophia was around 23. But the seeds he had planted had already taken root. A thought unthinkable within Russian tradition had lodged itself firmly in the Tsarevna's mind: if reason does not depend on sex, why should power belong only to men? While Sophia's sisters occupied themselves with traditional women's handiwork, she read chronicles and studied how her ancestors had resolved political crises. She followed the dispatches of ambassadors and understood how Russia appeared in the eyes of its neighbors, a backward country left on the margins of European history. All of this shaped in her mind an image of what the country ought to be and who might change it. Chapter 2. The Tsar who could not walk. Alexei Mikhailovich left behind a vacuum of power. The heir was his eldest son, Fyodor, a sickly youth barely able to bear the weight of the duties of state. Behind his back, the boyar clans immediately began their struggle. The Tsar had two sets of relatives, each grasping for power. From Alexei Mikhailovich's first marriage to Maria Miloslavskaya were born Fyodor, Sophia, and the frail Ivan. From the second marriage to Natalia Nerishkina came the strong and healthy Peter. These two clans, the Miloslavskis and the Nerishkins, had become irreconcilable rivals. Sophia observed this struggle and understood a simple truth: whoever controls the Tsar controls Russia. And if the Tsar is weak, real power passes to those closest to the throne. She began to act with method. She took to nursing her ailing brother Fyodor, reading state papers aloud to him, discussing decisions, offering advice. The Tsar suffered from scurvy and some unknown illness that twisted his legs. He could barely sit on the throne during ceremonies, was carried on a litter, and could sign decrees only with great pain. In such circumstances, Sophia's presence became almost indispensable. The boyars were the highest hereditary nobility, the Russian equivalent of dukes and earls. noticed with astonishment that this woman from the Terem understood politics better than many of them. Some were outraged. How could a woman meddle in affairs of state? But Sophia acted with caution. Never openly claiming power, she simply made herself present when she was needed. By the end of Fyodor's reign, she was no longer an unknown recluse. Her name was known at court, her opinion carried weight. She had become a cold, calculating politician, and all that remained was to wait for the moment to make the decisive move. Chapter 3, Death without an Heir. On April 27, 1682, Tsar Fyodor Alekseyevich died in his chambers. He was 20 years old, but illness had so wasted his body that he looked like an old man. Fyodor died childless, and before Russia loomed a question capable of tearing the state apart: who would be the next Tsar? Formerly, there were two claimants: 15-year-old Ivan, the elder of the surviving brothers, and 10-year-old Peter, the youngest son from the second marriage. Ivan had the stronger formal claim as the elder, but he had a grave problem. He suffered from a mental disability and near total blindness. He could barely speak coherently or move without help. The Naryshkins acted swiftly. On the very day of Fyodor's death, they convened the Boyar Duma, the council of the high nobility, and Patriarch Aokim.
The Patriarch was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, comparable in standing to the Pope for Catholics.
Their ally, and held a vote. The result was foregone. 10-year-old Peter was proclaimed Tsar, and his mother, Natalia Kirillovna, became regent. Sophia understood what had happened even before the Kremlin's bells rang out to announce the new Tsar. The Naryshkins had carried out a coup without asking her or the Miloslavskis. It was a humiliation and, in effect, a death sentence. Once the Naryshkins secured their power, Sophia would be sent to a convent and her kinsmen thrown out of the Kremlin. Two paths remained: to submit or to strike back. She chose the second. Her first step was a public challenge to centuries-old tradition. By custom, the Tsar's daughters could not appear in public, least of all at a funeral. But Sophia walked out of the Terem and joined the mourning procession behind her brother's coffin in full view of all Moscow. It was an extraordinary breach of decorum, a scandal that made the boyars and priests gasp. The crowd gathered for the funeral stared at her in amazement. Who was this woman, daring to break taboos that had held for centuries? Chapter 4, Gunpowder in the Barracks. After the funeral, Sophia set to work methodically. The Boyar Duma had already sworn allegiance to Peter. The Patriarch was on the Naryshkin side, but the Tsarevna held one trump card her opponents had not considered.
The Streltsy were hereditary musketeer guardsmen, functioning at once as Moscow's army and city police, comparable to the Ottoman Janissaries or the Praetorian Guard of Rome.
The Strelets regiments had been storing up grievances for years: delayed pay, the abuses of their commanders, the use of soldiers for heavy labor instead of military service. Sophia decided to channel this anger through trusted intermediaries. She began meeting secretly with the officers of the Strelets regiments, handing them money, promising that if power passed to her and to Ivan, all arrears would be paid and every wrong avenged. Gradually, rumors began to spread through the barracks that the Naryshkins meant to murder Tsarevich Ivan so that Peter alone would remain heir. There was no proof whatsoever, but a lie repeated often enough becomes truth for those who wish to believe it. The Streltsy felt they had been deceived and they thirsted for revenge. They needed only a pretext to explode. At dawn on May 25, 1682, 7,000 armed Streltsy gathered at the Kremlin walls, demanding that the villains be handed over and that Ivan be brought out alive. The negotiations dragged on, and the Naryshkins hesitated, and that proved to be a fatal mistake. The enraged mob burst into the Kremlin. Shouts, the pounding of feet, the clash of metal shook the ancient vaults of the palace. The Streltsy seized the boyars of the Naryshkin clan, accused them of treason, dragged them into the street, and killed them before the eyes of terrified women and children, among whom, hidden in the crowd of servants, stood 10-year-old Peter. The boy watched his kinsmen being killed. He heard the shouts and the death cries of men he had known since childhood. He watched the mob drag from their hiding places those whom everyone in the Kremlin had once feared and tear them literally to pieces. And he saw, or at least he would forever remember it so, that Tsarevna Sophia stood at the window of the terem and did nothing to stop the slaughter. That day was seared into the memory of the future Peter the Great. Hatred for his sister, terror of the rioting mob, contempt for disorder, all the feelings that would later define him as a ruler were born here, amid the blood and dust of the Kremlin courtyard on a May Day in 1682. Sophia did not flinch. She understood. Now everything was being decided. At her command, the living Ivan was led out to the Streltsy, pale, trembling, but alive. The crowd fell back. The proof of the Naryshkins' treason had been presented, and now the rebels needed someone to take power into their own hands. Sophia stepped out before the people, holding her head high, not a frightened woman, but a commander. It was in this bloody May noon that a mighty ruler was born, and she was born in blood, in smoke, in the cries of dying men whom all Moscow had feared only yesterday. Sophia stood on the porch, and her heart hammered so hard it seemed about to burst from her chest. Her hands shook. She clenched them into fists, hiding them in the folds of her heavy brocade gown so no one would see that treacherous trembling. Before her surged a sea of armed men, inflamed by blood and fury, and a single wrong gesture, one wrong word, and she herself could be torn apart as the Naryshkin boyars had been torn apart moments before. But she forced herself to breathe evenly. She forced her voice to hold steady. Inside, everything clenched with horror. She had seen only a few steps away. The Streltsy raised the body of Prince Ivan Naryshkin on their pikes, a man she had known for years, with whom she had sat at the same feast table. His cry had broken off so quickly, so ordinarily, that Sophia felt sick. But she did not let herself look away. She did not let herself go pale. She stared straight ahead and repeated to herself, with silent lips, "Not now. Now is not the time to be afraid. Later, everything later." Somewhere behind her, in the dark doorway of the palace, 10-year-old Peter was hiding. Sophia could not see him, but she knew with a woman's, a sister's instinct, that the boy was now frozen with terror, shaking, perhaps pressing his hands over his ears so as not to hear the cries of his dying kin. Part of her, the part that still remembered herself simply as an elder sister, wanted to rush to him, embrace him, shield him from this nightmare. But another part, the part already turning into a ruler, understood her brother's fear was working for her now. Let him fear. Let him remember this day all his life. Let this memory bind his hands for years to come. She did not know then the horrifying price of revenge to which this calculation would lead her 7 years hence. The crowd roared, demanding blood, demanding justice, And Sophia, gathering all the will there was in her fragile frame, stepped forward. She raised her hand, and, strange to say, the shouting began to die down. Thousands of armed men, maddened with rage, looked at her, a 19-year-old woman from the Terem whom they had never before seen, without a veil and guards, and something in her gaze made them fall silent. "Here is your sovereign Ivan, alive and unharmed." These words, spoken in a firm voice ringing with strain, carried across the bloodied square. Sophia felt the blood pound in her temples, her mouth go dry, but she did not let herself stop. Truth has triumphed. The traitors are punished. Now what is needed is order, and I will give you that order. In that moment, amid the smoke and blood of the Kremlin courtyard, a frightened Tsarevna became the ruler of Russia. Sophia herself could never afterward explain where those words came from, where that certainty in her voice had come from. It was simply that at some point the fear withdrew somewhere, and all that remained was a cold, ringing resolve, the resolve to survive at any price, the resolve not to let this day turn against her. Chapter 5. The theater behind the curtain. The Streltsy fell back not because they had sated their thirst for blood. They had simply gotten what they came for. Confirmation that they had been deceived, and a living witness to that deception. But a mob that has once felt its own strength rarely disperses quietly. It wants a continuation, it wants a leader, it wants assurance of the day to come. Sophia understood this better than anyone in the Kremlin. While the boyars hid in their homes, trembling for their lives, while Natalia Kirillovna rocked the terrified Peter somewhere deep in the palace, the Tsarevna feverishly worked out how to turn this bloody chaos into organized power, how to make what had happened, this horror, this slaughter, not be in vain, not turn against her. The answer she arrived at astonishes with its audacity even 3 centuries later. She could not simply take power for herself. Neither the boyars, nor the church, nor the people themselves would ever openly accept a woman as sovereign. Too deeply lodged in people's minds was the belief power is not for a woman's hands, but she could create a structure in which formal tradition would be preserved while real power belonged entirely to her. On June 26, 1682, in the Kremlin's Dormition Cathedral, the country's principal church, the place where every Russian monarch was crowned, an event took place that Russia had never seen before or since. Patriarch Aokim, gritting his teeth with indignation, was forced to crown 2 Tsars at once, 15-year-old half-blind Ivan and 10-year-old Peter. Picture the scene: 2 boys, one barely able to stand, the other a mere child, both in unbearably heavy golden robes studded with gems, both crowned with the cap of Monomac, the jeweled crown of the Russian Tsars. The crowd in the cathedral froze in astonishment. 2 anointed of God at once? Such a thing had never been, for in Russia there had always been 1 Tsar, 1 anointed, 1 will. The people whispered, crossed themselves, unable to comprehend how it could be. But the most extraordinary thing was hidden behind the backrest of a specially made double throne, a massive silver structure that can still be seen today in the Kremlin armory. Behind this throne was concealed a small window hung with heavy cloth, and when foreign ambassadors, dressed in velvet and silk, solemnly approached the throne for an audience, when boyars in tall fur hats bowed low before the 2 boy Tsars, there, behind the curtain, invisible to all, sat Sophia. She listened to every word through that little window, holding her breath, and in a whisper prompted her brothers on what to answer. Picture the scene from within little Peter, gripping the scepter with fingers unsteady from nerves, straining to hear his sister's whisper behind him, and repeating her words like a frightened actor who has forgotten his lines. Every audience was a play, meticulously directed by a woman whom none of those present ever even saw. Sophia was triumphant, but secretly, inwardly. This triumph was poisoned by dread. She knew sooner or later the curtain would fall. Sooner or later the boys behind the throne would cease to be mere puppets. Chapter 6, Ahead on the Square. By 1684, Sophia Alekseyevna's name had begun to appear in official documents alongside those of her Tsar brothers. An unheard of thing, unthinkable only a year before, but power won by blood demanded constant defense, and soon the Tsarevna had to reckon with a man who considered himself the true architect of her triumphs, Prince Ivan Khovansky, commander of the Strelets forces. Khovansky, the very man who had led the May revolt, had grown dangerously self-assured. He strode about the Kremlin with the air of a victor, hinting to all and sundry that without him, without his Streltsy, no ruler named Sophia would exist at all. He ignored her orders and permitted himself insolent remarks in the presence of boyars. And with each day a cold, clammy dread grew in Sophia's heart. This man could at any moment turn the Strelets' bayonets against her, exactly as he had once turned them against the Naryshkins. At night she lay awake, listening to the creak of floorboards beyond the door, imagining that one day the mob would burst in, no longer for the Naryshkins, but for her. This fear, sticky and constant, drove her to a decision from which she knew there would be no return. In the autumn of 1682, Sophia lured Khovansky to a village outside Moscow, ostensibly for important negotiations. He came suspecting nothing, self-assured as ever, and there he was seized by Streltsy, whom Sophia had managed to buy over, to win to her side. The prince was accused of treason with little inquiry and executed that very day. Khovansky's head was set out on the square, a terrible, bloody warning to anyone who might dare doubt her power. Sophia learned that the execution had been carried out late at night, and, left alone in her chambers, she sat motionless for a long time, staring into the flame of a candle. What did she feel in that moment? Relief, horror at her own cruelty, triumph, perhaps all at once. She, a woman raised from childhood to pray and to embroider, had just ordered a man killed without trial. With a trembling hand she crossed herself, whispered a prayer, and at the same time knew, deep within, that she would do it again if she had to. Power demanded blood. She had paid the price, and she did not intend to stop. Chapter 7. A kindred soul. Power without love is a cold burden that will sooner or later crush even the strongest ruler. Sophia Alekseyevna understood this better than anyone at court. She had seized the throne, eliminated her rivals, forced the boyars to acknowledge her regency, but at night, in the silence of her chambers, she remained an infinitely lonely woman in a world that belonged entirely to men. She needed someone she could trust not only with affairs of state, but with her fears, her doubts, her bold dreams of Russia's future. And such a man was found. Prince Vasily Vasilievich Golitsyn, one of the most educated and charming men of his age. Her Golitsyn was unlike the other boyars of Moscow. Those who clung to the old ways, feared everything new, and measured a man's worth by the length of his beard. He had traveled, read European books, knew Latin and Polish, and had gathered in his Moscow home a library of hundreds of volumes, an incredible treasure in a country where a book was a rarity. In his halls stood genuine European furniture, chairs, tables, mirrors in gilded frames, paintings on the walls. He wore clothing of Western cut, shaved his beard in an age when this was considered nearly a sin, and said openly, Russia must learn from the West if it wished to survive among the great powers. When Sophia first truly saw this man, she felt something she had never known before. She was understood, not as a Tsarevna, not as a political figure, but as a person who thought as she did, who dreamed of the very things she craved. In a world where everyone saw in her either a threat or a rung on the ladder to their own advantage, Golitsyn saw in her a personality, and this proved more dangerous than any palace conspiracy, because for the first time in her life, Sophia allowed herself to grow attached. She appointed him head of the ambassadorial chancery, in our terms, Minister of Foreign Affairs. But his influence extended far beyond diplomacy. He became her closest advisor on all matters, from the army to the treasury, from judicial reform to education. It was his signature that stood beside hers on the state's most important documents. Their relationship remained one of the great mysteries of Russian history. Sophia could not call Golitsyn her husband. The Church would never have blessed a marriage between a Tsarevna and a subject, and besides, he was married and had children. Divorce in Orthodox Russia of the 17th century was all but impossible. But contemporaries had no doubt between the ruler and her favorite there existed a bond deeper than any political alliance. They spent long evenings together, bent over maps and draft decrees, and in those hours Sophia was almost happy, for the first time in her whole life, a life full of struggle, fear, and loneliness. There was beside her a person before whom she need not pretend. It was precisely this personal attachment that made their political alliance so strong, and, as would later become clear, made Sophia herself so vulnerable because of it. Chapter 8, Dreams Ahead of Their Time. Together, Sophia and Golitsyn conceived the impossible, to transform backward Muscovy into a modern European state. Their designs were so bold that they largely anticipated the reforms for which Peter the Great would later be celebrated. Golitsyn wanted to soften the cruel laws of his time. He proposed limiting torture in the courts, abolishing the death penalty for religious offenses, granting more rights to the peasantry. Boldest of all was his idea to gradually abolish serfdom, effectively the slavery that bound millions of peasants to the land of their masters. He understood as long as the country rested on slave labor, it was doomed to remain weak and poor. Sophia supported these designs, though she knew the landowning boyars would fight to the death against any attempt to free the serfs. Many of these plans remained on paper, but their very existence said a great deal. The ruler and her favorite thought of Russia not as a prize to be squeezed dry, but as a living organism that could be nurtured and strengthened. The chief achievement of these years was the founding, in 1687, of the Slavic Greek Latin Academy, the first institution of higher learning in Russia. It was a revolution. For the first time, young men could study not only church texts but also philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, and foreign languages. The academy prepared a new generation, educated officials, diplomats, scholars. Sophia understood a simple but bitter truth. Without education, Russia would never catch up with Europe. Moscow began to change before people's eyes. Stone buildings in the European style appeared, printing houses opened, the streets were paved with stone. At court, figures in foreign dress began to flit about, and French and German speech could be heard. The conservative nobility and clergy grumbled, calling Golitsyn a heretic and a secret accomplice of the Catholics. But Sophia defended her favorite. She saw what they did not. Russia simply had no choice. Either the country would change and grow strong, or it would be crushed by its more developed neighbors, Poland, Sweden, the Ottoman Empire. But this brilliant alliance had one fatal flaw. Everything rested on Sophia's personal authority. Should she lose power, all the dreams would collapse along with her. And a threat was already gathering. On the horizon, her younger brother Peter was growing up, and with each year he needed the guardianship of his elder sister less and less. Chapter 9. The Ashes of the Southern Steppe. In the spring of 1686, a Polish embassy arrived in Moscow. The war between Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had dragged on for decades, and the central question remained unresolved. To whom did Kiev belong, the ancient cradle of the Russian state? Sophia saw in this her chance to enter history not as a usurper, but as a wise ruler who had settled a centuries-old dispute. Golitsyn conducted the negotiations for months, bargaining over every city, and achieved a triumph. On April 21, 1686, eternal peace was signed. Russia gained Kiev forever, along with vast lands. It was an enormous diplomatic victory. But every victory has its price. The Poles would not have given up Kiev for nothing. In return, they demanded military aid against a common enemy, the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the mighty Ottoman Empire. The Crimean Tatars had tormented the southern frontier for centuries, launching raids and driving tens of thousands into slavery. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia pledged to join the anti-Turkish coalition of the European powers and to begin a war against the Crimea. Sophia agreed. Borne aloft by dreams of glory, she imagined Russian troops crushing the Tatars and returning to Moscow in triumph. Imagined how this victory would silence all her critics. She believed in Golitsyn as a military commander. Reality proved merciless. The first campaign began in the spring of 1687. Golitsyn assembled an enormous army, around 100,000 men. The troops marched south into the boundless steppe, where there were no roads, no water, no fortifications. And here the Crimeans deployed a terrible weapon. They set fire to the steppe. The dry grass blazed for hundreds of miles. The wells were poisoned and filled in, the livestock driven off. The Russian army trudged through black ash and choking smoke, gasping with heat and thirst. Horses fell, men died of disease by the hundreds. Without even reaching the borders of the Crimea, the army turned back, never having seen the enemy face to face. The return was humiliating. Thousands had died, and not a single victory, not a single fortress taken. Sophia desperately tried to pass off the failure as a success. She staged a triumphal welcome for Golitsyn, showered him with honors, ordered Thanksgiving services sung. But the people were not fools. In Moscow's marketplaces and taverns they whispered, "The ruler is deceiving us." Golitsyn botched it all. Thousands of lads perished in the steppe for nothing. She stood at the window and heard the echo of these rumors rising from the city. And for the first time in her years at the throne, she felt the ground giving way beneath her feet. She understood. By rewarding a favorite who had waged the campaign so ineptly, she had defied the obvious. And everyone saw it. But there was nowhere to retreat. The Allies demanded that the war continue, and in 1689 Golitsyn led south a second army, larger still, 150,000 men. This time the troops reached Perekop, the narrow isthmus, the gateway into the Crimea. But before the mighty Tatar fortifications, Golitsyn faltered. And again the steppe burned, again the water ran out, again disease mowed the men down. The army retreated, having achieved nothing. When Golitsyn returned empty-handed a second time, it became impossible to conceal the catastrophe. 2 campaigns, tens of thousands dead, a treasury emptied, and all for nothing. In Moscow, it was said openly, Sophia keeps a talentless commander at her side only because he is her lover. The boyars criticized Golitsyn to his face. The church accused the ruler of pride. Even the Streltsy, her chief support, began to doubt. Sophia felt everything she had built falling apart. In desperation, she demanded to be styled no longer regent but autocrat, a sovereign in her own right. She commissioned formal portraits in which she appeared crowned with scepter and orb in her hands. But the louder she proclaimed her rights, the more obvious her weakness became. Real power has no need to shout of itself on every corner. Chapter 10. The Boy Who Grew Up. While Sophia ruled from the Kremlin, her chief enemy was growing up in the village of Preobrazhenskoye outside Moscow. Peter Alekseyevich, that same 10-year-old boy who had trembled with terror during the May slaughter, had grown into a tall, powerful youth of untamable energy and unpredictable temper. He had never forgotten that day, the blood on the palace steps, the cries of dying kinsmen, the mob tearing men to pieces, and his sister standing at the window and not raising a hand to stop it. From this childhood terror grew a cold, grown man's hatred. Peter could not live in the Kremlin, where every stone recalled the nightmare. He moved to Preobrazhenskoye and created there a world of his own, without ceremonies, without bows, without the suffocating etiquette of the palace. Here there was freedom. He played at war, built boats, and befriended the foreigners of the German quarter, the district where the Europeans who had come to serve in Russia lived. Sophia looked on all this with contempt, considering her brother an eccentric, overgrown child amusing himself with toy soldiers instead of learning to govern the state. This was her fatal mistake. For Peter's toy soldiers were real. From young noblemen and common lads he formed the so-called play regiments. The name sounds like a game, but in fact this was a genuine, if small, army undergoing real military training. Peter personally commanded the maneuvers, learned to fire cannon and to storm fortresses. He did not shrink from menial labor. He hauled logs, dug trenches, slept in a tent beside his soldiers. For a Russian Tsar, such behavior was unthinkable. It was beneath a sovereign to dirty his hands. But Peter cared nothing for convention. He wanted to understand war from the inside, not from a study. In time, these play regiments would become the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky guards, the elite guard, the core of the new Russian army and the most loyal support of his power. While Sophia wove palace intrigues, her younger brother was coldly forging the military machine destined to crush her. The year 1689 proved decisive. Peter turned 17. By the laws of the time, he had come of age. His mother hastened to marry her son to a boyar's daughter, Eudoxia Lopukina, and in this marriage lay a deep political calculation. A married Tsar no longer needed a guardian. Formally, Sophia's right to rule in his name simply vanished. But she had no intention of leaving. She continued to sign decrees, receive ambassadors, dispense justice. And Peter seethed with rage, seeing in this a brazen usurpation. Between brother and sister a cold war began. At church festivals Peter demonstratively refused to stand beside her. When boyars proposed to discuss matters with the Tsarevna, he replied that he recognized no right of hers to interfere in the governance of the state. Sophia kept up appearances, but inside everything went cold. She understood the main thing: her younger brother no longer feared her. That frightened boy from the May nightmare had grown up, grown strong, and now he had come for what he considered his by right. Chapter 11. The Night of Flight. By August 1689, the tension had reached its peak. Moscow split in two. The sky over the capital pressed down with heat. The air was steeped in the smoke of bonfires and in dread. Rumors crept through the city. Sophia was preparing a new Strelitz revolt to kill Peter and crown herself. Others whispered that it was Peter gathering troops to storm the Kremlin and seize his sister. Both were arming. Everyone understood there would be no peaceful outcome. Once again, as 7 years before, Sophia felt the familiar icy prickle of fear. Only now the scratch of her pen in the night's silence was no longer the sound of confident power, but a nervous, feverish attempt to hold on to the ground slipping from beneath her feet. The resolution came at night, and it came from an entirely unexpected direction. Peter was awakened in the dead of night at Preobrazhenskoye by news, perhaps false, perhaps magnified by fear, that Sophia had sent the Streltsy to kill him. In that instant, all the horror of the May slaughter, dormant in his soul for years, burst forth. The 17-year-old Tsar, a huge, powerful youth capable of bending horseshoes, leaped from his bed, out of his mind with panic, and fled. Barefoot, in nothing but his nightshirt, he dashed out into the darkness, sprang onto a horse, and galloped away from Moscow. This was no calculated political move. It was the pure animal terror of a man who had been taught in childhood to fear this woman and these Streltsy. He drove his horse all night, and at dawn reached the Trinity Sergeslavra, an ancient, powerfully fortified monastery to which Russian rulers had fled for centuries in times of trouble, seeking both the protection of stone walls and the spiritual support of the church. And here Peter's flight turned against Sophia in the most unexpected way. Moscow awoke in confusion. The Tsar had fled, and this flight, this image of a young, lawful sovereign fleeing in the night from his villainous sister, proved mightier than any army. People streamed toward the Lavra. The first to support Peter was the Patriarch. The church had never made peace with a woman in power. After him came regiments, delegations of cities, boyars who only yesterday had sworn loyalty to Sophia. Each day someone new slipped quietly out of Moscow and rode off to Trinity. Power was slipping through Sophia's fingers like water from a cupped hand. She tried to hold on. She issued orders, gathered the Streltsy who remained loyal, promised rewards, but all was in vain. She sent envoys to her brother with appeals for reconciliation. They were not admitted. She sent the Patriarch himself to persuade Peter, and the Patriarch, on reaching the Lavra, simply remained there on the Tsar's side. And then came the most bitter moment. Sophia turned to the one on whom she had leaned all these years, to Golitsyn, and she saw in the eyes of the man she loved not resolve but weariness and resignation. He did not rush to save her, offered no daring plan, did not stand as a wall. He only sighed quietly, sorrowfully, and in that sigh she read everything. He had already accepted defeat. He was already thinking of how to surrender to the new power and survive. This was more terrible than any betrayal by the boyars. The man to whom she had given not only power, but her heart had let his hands fall first. In those September days, left almost alone in the cold Kremlin chambers, where the candles now lit not triumph, but defeat, Sophia understood for the first time. To the very end it was all over. She looked at her reflection in a dull mirror, ringed by the trembling gleam of candles, and did not recognize herself. The woman who had broken out of the gilded cage of the Terem, who had taken the summit of power by storm, who had held an enormous country in her hands for 7 years, was now becoming a prisoner once more, and this time there was nowhere to flee. Chapter 12. The walls of Novodevichy. In the autumn of 1689, Sophia Alekseyevna stood at the gates of the Novodevichy convent and gazed at the white stone walls that were now to become the boundaries of her world. Peter had won. He returned to Moscow in triumph, received the oath of the boyars and the Streltsy, and disposed of his sister's fate. This time he did not force her to take the veil. He had not yet come to that. Sophia was simply confined to the convent as a noble prisoner. She remained a Tsarevna, but stripped of all power, all freedom, and all right to see anyone without the Tsar's leave. Golitsyn, her support, her love, was stripped of all his ranks and property and sent into perpetual exile to the distant, icy north. They would never see each other again. Somewhere in the frozen wilderness lived out his days the man with whom she had once dreamed of remaking an entire country, while she faded away behind the convent walls. Their shared dream of a new Russia dissolved without a trace, as though it had never been. The first years of confinement were agonizing. Sophia, who only yesterday had commanded an enormous state, could not reconcile herself to a cramped, cold cell, to a window looking onto the courtyard, where nuns glided like silent shadows. But she did not break, nor did she wholly submit. Through rare letters and scraps of rumor, she continued to follow events with hunger. How Peter went off to study in Europe, how he broke the old order, how he changed the country, and, a strange thing, part of her soul rejoiced at it, for it was she, Sophia, who had first begun this movement toward the West. Peter was only continuing the path she had laid. She lived in this ghostly peace for nearly 10 years, not entirely losing hope. And perhaps it was precisely this smoldering hope that destroyed her. Chapter 13. Bodies beneath the windows. In 1698, while Peter was traveling through Europe, a new Strelitz revolt broke out in Moscow. The Streltsy, worn down by harsh service, murmured against the new order and, by rumor, dreamed of freeing Sophia and returning her to the throne. Sophia herself took no part in the plot. Under strict surveillance, she could physically do nothing. But her name alone, hovering over the revolt, proved enough. Peter came racing back from abroad beside himself with fury. What he unleashed upon the rebels astonished even hardened contemporaries with its cruelty. Thousands of Streltsy were tortured and executed. The executions were public, deliberately terrible, drawn out over weeks. Peter wished not merely to punish, but to root out the very core of the old order, of that world which had once drenched the courtyard of his childhood in blood. And for his sister, he prepared a special, elaborate punishment. By his order, the bodies of the hanged Streltsy were strung up directly beneath the windows of Sophia's cell. The corpses swayed in the autumn wind for weeks, knocking against the walls in the silence. And every morning, on opening her eyes, the prisoner saw them, men who had died dreaming of freeing her. Into the dead hands of one of the hanged, whose body had been drawn up to her very window, was placed a petition, a plea addressed to her, Sophia. The message was utterly clear and merciless. This is what happens to those who speak your name. Any hope, any attempt to return, will end like this, with swaying bodies beneath your window. It was precisely this monstrous scene that, 2 centuries later, would inspire the painter Vasily Surikov to conceive his famous canvas, the morning of the execution of the Streltsy, though in the final painting he chose not to depict the figure of Sophia herself. After that autumn, Sophia broke completely. She understood, irrevocably, with her whole being, that there would be no return ever, that her brother would never forgive her. It was now, and not in 1689, that she was made to take the veil, stripped even of her former name. Henceforth she was no longer Tsarevna Sophia, but the nun Susanna, and, strangely, only when she had lost her last hope did she find a semblance of peace. Her final years she passed in sincere prayer. She helped the poor, gave alms to the church, read the books she was permitted. The woman who had once dictated decrees to an enormous power now became simply one of many nameless nuns. She grew old, gaunt, her health failed. In 1704, in the 47th year of her life, the nun Susanna, she who had been Tsarevna Sophia, died quietly in her cell. Peter did not come to the funeral. She was buried in the Novodevichy convent modestly, without honors, like an ordinary nun, and not like a woman who had ruled one of the greatest powers of Europe for 7 years. Epilogue. A door and a window, history dealt cruelly with Sophia's memory, for the chronicles are written by the victors. Peter, who became the great, saw to it that his sister's reign would be remembered by posterity as a dark age of usurpation and stagnation. She was portrayed as a cunning schemer who had seized power by deception, unleashed senseless wars, and nearly ruined the country. The wicked stepmother of a fairy tale, obstructing the good young hero from ascending his lawful throne. This image held in the popular memory for centuries, and only modern historians have dared to look at her differently and to see the truth. And the truth is that the reign of Sophia Alekseyevna became the bridge between two worlds. She was the door through which old Muscovy first glanced toward Europe, and the window through which her brother, Peter, would later fling the country wide open to the west. Everything he is credited with, the pull toward European learning, the reform of the army, the reach for the sea, the impatience with the suffocating old ways, had first stirred quietly and cautiously under her hand. She dreamed the very dreams Peter would later realize with fire and iron. She simply lacked his ruthlessness, his time, and the one thing no talent can supply, the right to be born a man. She had broken out of the gilded cage of the Terem, the first woman in Russian history to rule the state in her own name. She had held power for 7 years in a world built entirely to keep women like her invisible. And though she died a nameless nun, forgotten and disgraced, she had proved something that no chronicle written by the victors could ever wholly erase: that a mind is not bound by the body it is born into, and that a woman locked behind mica windows could, for a time, hold an empire in her hands. She was the door. Her brother was the flood that poured through it. But the door came first.